together, so I missed the highlights. I could tell it was a Reformed Jewish school because you're singing a Hasidic niggun. So. Very nice to be here, and thank you for coming. It's a strange assignment. Well, talk to them about God language, talk to them about theology, tell them what Jews are thinking these days. So I'll give it a little bit of a try. I think the most important part of the session may be question-answer, dialogue, conversation afterwards. But if I don't say something first, you won't have what to ask on the basis of. So let me begin. When they write the history of what happened to Judaism in the beginning of the 21st century, and there are historians out there, Jonathan Sarna's minions are out there taking notes already. When they write the history of this period, one of the things they'll say about Judaism in these decades is that this is the period when the Jewish community struggled to retrieve the mystical tradition for the Jewish mainstream, or struggled over the question of retrieving the mystical tradition for the Jewish mainstream. The way, if you look at Jewish history, 1970s, 1980s, Soviet Jewry was what dominated the agenda. 1980s, 1990s, I would say the inclusion of women, feminist issues, feminist liturgy, and so on. So that was the issue Judaism was struggling with. In these decades, a significant part of it will be that question of, quote, spirituality, a word that I bear some guilt for making respectable in the Jewish community. And I have some sense of the mixed blessings of that. And it's a phenomenon that goes across the board. The Kabbalah centers, which I am not a big fan of, as you can imagine, are one end of that phenomenon. The brilliant, wonderful translation of the Zohar that my friend Daniel Matt is doing for Stanford University is another end of that phenomenon. When I was a rabbinical student in the 1960s, Jewish mysticism was not taught in any American rabbinical school outside of Lubavitch. Heschel, my teacher, was not permitted to teach Hasidism for his regular courses because that was not mainstream Judaism. He could teach it on his own time to a few students who were interested, but that was not mainstream Judaism. Whereas today, all of the rabbinical seminaries, HUC, JTS, and so on, I must say when I was at RRC in Philadelphia, we were the first to require a course in Jewish mysticism for future rabbis, but now it's across the board. When I was a student, if you wanted to read in Jewish mysticism in English, you had Sholem and you had Buber, and you had Buber and you had Sholem, and then you had to go to sort of occult bookstores to find the secrets of the Holy Kabbalah. Nowadays, walk into Israel bookstore, there's a whole wall, there are walls of books on the mystical tradition. Not all of them good books, by the way, and I don't recommend them all. There are more books written on Jewish meditation in the last decade than in the previous millennium, that's for sure. And again, a few of them good books. So you do have to be careful. But there's a tremendous, tremendous growth of interest. It's exactly 200 years since a new concept in Judaism was initiated that never existed before. In fact, it's a concept you have no word for in Hebrew, and that is mainstream Judaism. The notion of mainstream Judaism, try to say it in Hebrew and you'll see how awkward it is. The notion of mainstream Judaism was created by Western enlighteners and by the early creators of the scientific study of Judaism, the Wissenschaft scholars, beginning of the 19th century. If you ask what mainstream Judaism doesn't include, what's outside the mainstream, the concept of mainstream Judaism is created primarily not to be inclusive, but to be exclusive. It's primarily the mystical tradition, along with certain kinds of popular piety and what people call superstitions, things westernizing, modernizing, philosophically oriented Jews were embarrassed by. Things that made Jews look too odd, make too different, not fitting in with the sort of Kantian and then neo-Kantian ethic. We are all believers in ethical monotheism. We have different rituals and different language, but essentially we believe in the rational, moral improvement of humanity. That's what religion is all about. Kabbalah was something different. Jews have access to the secrets of the universe. They know the inner structure of being. Sweep it under the rug. That's not mainstream Judaism. Therefore, we don't have to deal with it. 200 years later, that rug is popping up. So why? What's going on? Why has this happened after 200 years of pretty firm stamping on that rug? Well, of course, it's not a uniquely Jewish phenomenon. We are part of a broader Western world. And I would say since I was a university student, that's half a century ago, believe it or not, since I was a university student, there has been a growing interest among circles, especially in this country, less so in Western Europe, but especially in this country, in various forms of esoteric religion. When I was a student, it was Zen Buddhism. Professor Suzuki was on campuses talking about Zen and the art of this and that. And then the various Indian teachers, the Maharishis and the autobiography of a yogi and so on. Always, each of them had some frilly, stupid stuff at the edge. So the Beatles become followers of the Maharishi, Madonna becomes a follower of Kabbalah. But each of them also had some deeper, more serious learning and some deeper, more serious people. The Jewish community made a terrible mistake in dismissing all of this as, quote, the cults. There are cults, there are Christian cults, there are Jewish cults, one can talk about what a cult is. But to dismiss all of Eastern religion and the interest in Eastern religion as the cults was completely missing the mark. After various Indian teachers and Vedanta and yoga, it then became the turn of the Tibetan Buddhists with all the jokes about on the mountaintop his name is Irving, you know them all. Nevertheless, Tibetan Buddhists. I really gave you the punchlines. Irving, come home. When she goes to meet the guru. You can make the joke around the punchline. And so it's been noticeable that among the disciples of these various Indian Eastern religions, there have been an unusual percentage of Jews. Some people say a third of the American followers of Western Buddhism are Jews. I don't know, it's hard to find a number, certainly a significant number. I would say some of the very best, most interesting books on spirituality written by Jews in the last 30 years are by Jack Cornford and Joseph Goldstein and Sylvia Boorstein, all of them, as you can tell from their names, well-known Buddhist teachers. Sylvia is very honest about this, so she writes a book called Funny You Don't Look Buddhist. But you understand what I'm saying. The rediscovery of Kabbalah is part of this parade. Though it's Western, it's esoteric and different, and therefore is drawn out. So still, what's all this about? Why has there been such an interest? I think you have to say that for the past 200 years, since that same 1800 mainstream Judaism period, the real religion of the West has not been Judaism, has not been Christianity, but has been the religion of progress. We are discovering the truth by scientific progress. We are discovering more and more. We're rolling away the darkness. Scientific discovery is about to tell us how we can do this and what the nature of that is. That religion of scientism can come lightly dressed in liberal Christianity or lightly dressed in liberal Judaism, but what people really believe is that truth is scientific truth and experimental truth, and we will move forward with that. And religion gave it a kind of veneer of respectability. I think that religion of scientism, please understand I'm not a Luddite, I'm not against scientific progress at all. I'm sort of distinguishing science from scientism, belief in science as a kind of religious faith. That scientism suffered a major blow in the middle of the 20th century by two very different phenomena which we can label Auschwitz and Hiroshima. Auschwitz asking how could that have happened in the most progressive scientific Nobel Prize winning of all societies of Europe, and Hiroshima, no moral equivalency please, but Hiroshima meaning we're now entering an age, and you were all born into that age, when you wake up every day thinking somebody could blow the whole thing up. That it's possible that the whole world as we know it will not survive. We once had a name for the guy, Dr. Strangelove was going to push the button, right? But we have watched in our time wavering back and forth between nuclear catastrophe and ecological catastrophe. What will destroy the world? For what reason won't our grandchildren survive? But we live with that. I think in an age when you live with that, you look for something deeper. You look for some deeper vision of life. And maybe we say, you know, in this rush to modernity, in this rush to the religion of progress, maybe there was some great wisdom that humanity had that got lost along the way. Maybe we can find out if we go back and unpack what we skipped over too fast. Maybe we can find out how not to kill each other, how to live at a slower pace, and not die of the heart attacks that come from modern civilization. Maybe the Buddhists have it on a mountaintop. Maybe the yogis have it. Maybe it comes from practicing yoga. Maybe the Kabbalists know some secret. So there's a turning back in a kind of postmodern way. The modern era is an era of scientific progress as the dominant religion. I'm suggesting postmodernity wants to go back in some ways to recover what was lost and to re-examine it. You know, there's a difference between pre-modern and postmodern religion, but maybe I'll come to that later. Why the East? Why didn't they turn to Christianity and Judaism primarily? Well, first of all, some people did. The growth of evangelical religion, you could say, even evangelical Judaism, if you want to call it that, but the growth of evangelical religion in response to the terrors of modernity is certainly something we see. But among intellectuals, among people with higher levels of education, it tends primarily to be toward Eastern religion. And that, I think, has a number of interesting reasons. Eastern religion wasn't tainted in the same way. It wasn't associated with that religion of progress. It wasn't latched onto it. For Jews, there's also no baggage, right? They never persecuted our ancestors. We don't have to hate them the way we have some kind of deep inner mixed feelings, antipathy toward Christianity because we remember some Jewish historical memory of Holocaust or of something before that. Buddhists never met Jews. They don't know what a Jew looks like, and that makes it easier in some ways. It's like eating tray for a Chinese restaurant. You know, they don't know you're Jewish when you walk in. And so that's, you know, but I think there's another reason, a very important reason. And that is the Western bringers of Eastern religious traditions. I'm saying this very cautiously. Those who brought the Eastern traditions to North America and to the West claimed that you did not have to believe in God. It was not a bad God. Close your eyes and be silent with me. Chant Om Shanti Om Shanti Om Shanti Om. Ask, do you believe? You walk into the synagogue, you open a siddur, it says Baruch Atah Hashem, blessed are you, and suddenly you're talking to somebody who is king of the universe or who is the, wait a minute, I didn't sign up for that, I don't think I believe in that. How can I really do this? Am I not being hypocritical? I don't think I believe in it. Whereas in the Eastern traditions, you were never asked to do that. Now, if you go to on the street Buddhism in Vietnam or Thailand, you'll find something very different. You'll find a whole panoply of gods and demons and angelic beings and so on. But as it was rarefied and brought to the West, the non-theistic side of Buddhism, or Vedanta, was very much emphasized, and the teachers knew as a kind of strategy, don't believe in, do you believe in this deity or that deity? Immediately go to the mystical core, immediately go to the spiritual core of what you're trying to do, which is to say, beginning with experience instead of belief. I want to suggest that we have developed a new kind of spiritually seeking atheist in our society. I wrote a piece, I gave a lecture about 1985 maybe, to a group of Reform rabbis in Cincinnati, a sort of national CCAR meeting in Cincinnati. And then it was a new deal. Now you'll say, so what? But 1985 was a new deal. A friend of mine had called me and shown me a singles ad in the New York Jewish Week that he followed those singles ads, a single rabbi in New York. He followed those ads and said, you got to see this one. And it said, DJF, you know what that is, a singles ad, yes, divorced Jewish female, 37, spiritual, not religious. Seeks like-minded, blah, 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 etc. And he said, who is she? So I gave this lecture about describing her. You could find her in a Kripalu Yoga Ashram weekend, for sure. But she also had Roman Karlbach records. And she fasted on Yom Kippur, but she said, well, it's really because I want to lose weight. And a whole sort of description of who she was. Now, of course, there are so many of her, it's taken for granted. Lots of people say spiritual. No, everybody says spiritual, not religious these days. But it says something. I want to read you just a line I wrote from a lecture I gave sometime shortly after that, talking about this new kind of atheism or atheism that I see emerging among Jews. What do we say to a Jew who asks, can you have a Jewish spiritual life without God? So they've told me you can have a Buddhist spiritual life without God. Can you have a Jewish spiritual life without God? Before we say no too quickly, listen to two people. One says, yes, I am a religious person. I believe in the oneness of all being. I feel a connection to something eternal and infinite that's present in my soul and yours. That's what my quest is all about. But I can't call it God. That means I don't consider it to be a willful, personal being. It is not someone I want to worship, someone to whom I can address prayers. Certainly the language of the synagogue, that of God as King of Kings and myself as a supplicating servant, is one I see no reason at all to adopt. Or another person in the Jewish community. I'm grateful for the inordinate gifts that nature has bestowed on me. I have health, sustenance, meaningful work, a loving partner, friends, and family. Sometimes when I walk on the beach or I'm alone outdoors on a beautiful day, I feel overwhelmed by gratitude and by a sense of inadequacy to express the fullness with which I feel blessed. That's about as close as I can come to prayer. But the prayer that wells up in me in such moments is addressed to life itself, not to someone in particular, and certainly not to quote God. All this has nothing to do with the synagogue, the cantor, the choir, or the uncomprehended Hebrew chants that feel like they come from another time and another place. This is not my father's atheism. Dad was an atheist. He really believed religion was the opiate of the masses. He really believed reality is socioeconomic reality and all this inner life stuff is garbage. That was the atheism of the 1930s, a leftist, anti-religious atheism. This is something very new. This is a deep religiosity, I would say. You want to call it spirituality, not religiosity, that's just playing with the words. It's a deep religiosity that has trouble with our kind of religious, our traditional Jewish kind of religious formulation. To dismiss these people from the Jewish community is a very big dismissal. To dismiss the old left Jewish communists, all right, they're marginal. But this is the heart and soul of some of the most interesting Jews we have. I write for those people because I'm one of them. I write for those people because I'm essentially one of them. I could identify with either of these statements, even though I fell in love with Judaism when I was a kid. I grew up in my grandparents' shul. I was attracted to Hasidism. I spent all my life reading and translating Hasidic texts. In some ways, I am spiritually very close to these people. When I write for these people, or try to create a Judaism for these, quote, these people, it's not like I'm over here and they're over there. I'm trying to, of the deep knowledge I have of Jewish sources from 50 years of doing it, and trying to pull out a Judaism that might work for them and for me. So that's what it's about. I have done that by turning primarily to the Hasidic tradition, and especially the Hasidic tradition as articulated in its very first generations, when Hasidism was still a new, rebellious, dangerous movement condemned by the rabbinate, fought by the religious establishment, before Hasidism made its great turn around 1800, 1810, to become a spearhead against modernity, and later defined as ultra-Orthodoxy. Had you told the Baal Shem Tov his disciples that Hasidism was ultra-Orthodox, they would have laughed at you, because they were being excommunicated by the great rabbis of the day. They were being persecuted for being innovative. So Hasidism made a great turn in its third or fourth generation, away from radical innovation, away from its own most radical ideas, in order to defend Judaism against that really dangerous enemy out there, which was modern modernity and westernization and pressure from the outside and so on. So I'm interested in Hasidism as it was in its first few generations, and that's much of what I spend my time studying, with some exceptions. There are some figures later who still embody that spirit. I spent years working on the Sfat Emet, who's a late 19th century master who still has some of that, but by and large, it's that early version I'm interested in.
Was that in Tzfat, by the way?
I'm sorry?
Was that in Tzfat?
No, I'm sorry, that's Eastern Europe. We are in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, southeastern Poland, around 1750, 1800. Very much influenced by what happened in Tzfat. Tzfat, 1650, 200 years earlier, 150 years earlier, is a kind of, it's the first creation of a prayer-centered, spiritual, life-centered Judaism. It's a great revival and very important. the influence of Tzfat somehow, and especially the image of Tzfat, the story of what happened in Tzfat, sort of circulated around the Jewish world, a tremendous ripple effect. It reached Eastern Europe, and this is, after that had cooked for 150 years in Eastern Europe, Hasidism is what emerged, with a lot of detours along the way, but that Tzfat influence is certainly important. If there's another information question, we'll get to the discussion afterwards. Another quick information question, feel free. So I'm talking now about the Baal Shem Tov, the first master of Hasidism, died in 1760, and his circle of disciples and the people around him. That is a Judaism that begins with experience. The Baal Shem Tov makes a discovery partly because he is an ecstatic personality. He's an ecstatic mystic personality, and he discovers in a kind of transforming way that the whole earth is filled with God's glory. There is no place that's empty of the presence of God. You have to learn to open your inner eye, and you will see everywhere that the world is brimming with the divine presence. And everything you do, every act you do, not just prayer, not just davening, not just mitzvot, but everything you do is a way of serving God, is a way of discovering God. And it's a kind of ecstatic revival of Judaism, you might say. Hasidism is a revival movement, you understand, as distinct from a reform movement. A reform movement says the forms of the tradition need to be updated. Right? The forms are not working anymore. Let's introduce sermons in German, let's introduce organ music, let's introduce decorum in the synagogue. These are the issues of reform, say in the 1830s in Germany, what first creates Reform Judaism. They're not interested in changing the nature of belief in God. They're primarily interested in the forms. Revivalism, we think of revivalism in this country usually sort of southern preachers and tent revivals, but revivalism says the old-time religion is fine. What's happened is that the life has gone out of it. We have to renew the spirit, right? We have to relight the fire. Rav Nachman of Bratslav says, Jews are like knishes. The ingredients are all the same, but I prefer the hot ones to the cold ones. Relight the fire. What he means. So it's that kind of ecstatic rediscovery that Judaism is about the inner life. Judaism is about the inner life, which means to say there is a reality one experiences inside oneself that reveals a deeper or truer vision of what existence is all about. Mysticism. Mysticism means that it is possible to have a direct, unmediated, experiential contact with God, with the One, with absolute being, with truth, with whatever you call it. That you can penetrate all the forms and penetrate all the mediated principles and be directly in the presence and know it. To do that, I'm sort of giving you a classic definition of mysticism. To do that, you have to remove the veils. We live with a kind of superficial vision of what reality is. There is a deeper truth. You have to lift a veil. You have to go beyond the pshat, the simple external explanation of things. The mystic sees the relationship between God and the world, not as creator and creation. Creator's over there, then God creates a world that's other than God. The relationship is more like surface appearance and deep structure. Penetrate the surface appearance and you will find the deep structure of reality, the deep underlying oneness of reality, that is God. So therefore, the journey becomes a journey inward. I write in my books about the contest in the history of Judaism between what I call the vertical metaphor and the internal metaphor. Yes, the vertical metaphor, where is God? Up there, and we're down here. Hashamayim, Shamayim, Adonai, V'aretz Atami V'adam. God is in heaven and we're on earth. That's a very deep part of Judaism. Yes, Jacob's ladder. Moses gets the Torah from heaven at Sinai, the tallest mountain, which is covered in cloud. That's a very ancient metaphor, but it's not originally Jewish. It's not original to the Torah. It's part of what our ancestors inherited from the ancient Near East. Marduk and Baal also lived in the heavens. In fact, they were heaven gods as opposed to Tiamat, who was an earth goddess. So the gods in heaven is a very old notion. And therefore, the journey to God is a journey upward. I believe that the contest between the journey upward and the journey inward already begins in the Torah. At the end of Dvarim, when Moses is giving his final speeches, he says, Lo b'shamayim hi, le'mor mi ya'ala l'mashamayim. It's not in heaven. The Torah, teaching the truth, is not in heaven to say who will go up to heaven and bring the voice. He's not saying it used to be in heaven until I brought it down. He's saying, no, this is a different voice of Moses, however you want to parse that. It's a different voice of Moses. It's not in heaven, it's not be'ever layam, it's not across the sea, but it's beficha u'bilvacha lasoto. It's in your heart and in your mouth, so therefore the journey becomes an inward one, not an upward one. I'm going to detour if you find this interesting, those of you who are students of Judaism. Many of you may know the most famous mystical story in the Jewish tradition, the story of Arba'ah Nichnasu l'Pardes, 4 people who entered the orchard or the garden of mystical speculations told in the Talmud. Rabbi Akiva and 3 of his friends. One went mad, one died, one became a heretic, left the rabbis for whatever other tradition, and only Rabbi Akiva, Nirnas b'shalom v'yatzah b'shalom, he entered the Pardes, the orchard, in peace, and came out in peace. You want to understand what that orchard is. What does it mean to be a mystic? Well, it's the Talmud. Look at Rashi on the side of the page. He tells you, Alu larakia al yedei shem. They went up to the sky by means of a name. Which is to say, Rashi still lives in that pre-philosophical early medieval universe where there are holy names and they have power. And if you say the right holy name backwards and forwards and backwards, whatever it is, with the right kavanah, you can. Alu larakia. They went up to the sky by means of a name. If you don't like Rashi, however, if you're not happy with him, look at the bottom of the page. There's a fellow named Rabbeinu Hananel, also the same century as Rashi. Interestingly, he's a North African, and they were much more advanced. They had already studied philosophy. He says the whole thing happened b'uvanta de liba, behavanat halev, and he sends you back to Hai Gaon, even a century earlier, who says bechadrei libam hayu mistaklin. They were gazing into the chambers of their hearts. So right there on the page, you can see that confrontation. Vertical metaphor, internal metaphor. Upward journey, inward journey. And I think the mystic is one who thinks mainly in terms of the inward journey, even though they use vertical metaphors plenty. Again, remove the veil. Remove the veil, go deeper, and you will find access to that inner truth. The other thing I'll say about mysticism, and this is a generalization which you can find have to put lots of footnotes on. The essential mystical truth is that there is only one. Where you thought there were many, there turns out to be one. Where you thought there was separation and difference, there is ultimate unity. The Jewish mystics meditates on the Shema, and ultimately it's about the oneness of all being. The Christian mystic discovers the oneness within the Trinity. The Indian mystic, the oneness between the 10,000 forms of illusion of Maya and so on. It's ultimately mystical truth leads to not there is only one God, but there is only one. So you open the Tanya, which is you probably know, the second Bible of Chabad, and you read there a powerful interpretation of a verse which we know if you open the Siddur, because it's a verse that's in the Alenu. V'yadat hayom v'ashivot elevavecha ki Adonai hu Elohim b'shamayim v'mal v'aretz mitachat ein od. Know in your heart that God is one, in heaven above, and earth beneath, ein od. We translate it, there is no other God. They translate it, there is nothing else. You understand the difference? There is nothing else. Meaning that everything is God somehow. Everything, there is only one. Well, that leads to the edge of what people call pantheism, which is to say everything is God, and pantheism, wait a minute, isn't that dangerous? Does that mean you're going to say you're God? And does that mean what happens to ethics in pantheism? What happens to responsibility in pantheism? What happens to lots of things? People are a little bit afraid of pantheism. What happens about evil? Do you sanctify everything? Therefore, is everything permitted? People have lots of nervousness about pantheism. Some of it justified, some of it not, I think, but that's a longer conversation. They usually wind up, Hasidut usually winds up with what's called panentheism, which is to say the divine presence is in everything, Yes, in evil as well as good, in darkness as well as light, but the divine mystery extends beyond that. We can never really know what the one is. Or the whole is infinitely more than the sum of its parts. So if you add up all the things in the world and say, that's God, that's sort of Spinoza pantheism, they would say, no, there is still infinite mystery beyond that. In other words, this kind of Judaism still uses God language. In some ways, it's a very God-centered Judaism, but it's a very different notion of what God is. Let me do it a couple of different ways. Let me go around it a couple other ways. The word God, of course, is not a Hebrew word. Right? God comes from German, Gott, and that comes from the Old Norse gods. So let's speak Hebrew instead of English if we're talking about Judaism. Then, of course, you immediately have Yud Hey Vav Hey in front of you, the name of God which we're not permitted to pronounce. Yud Hey Vav Hey, that name that Moses, that's revealed to Moses. Those of you who know Hebrew will know, of course, that Yud Hey Vav Hey is really an artificial form of the verb to be. It's Hayah Yeh, all sort of pushed together in a form that doesn't exist. It should really be translated, is, was, will be. Not God. Is, was, will be. It's translated Lord in English because since Targum HaShivim, since the Septuagint, around 200 BCE, whenever it said Yud Hey Vav Hey, the Greek translator put in Kyrios, put in Lord, because you didn't mention the name Yud Hey Vav Hey. In other words, they were probably already saying Adonai instead of Yud Hey Vav Hey by the 2nd century before the Common Era. We have a very interesting midrash about that name Adonai. Very interesting story in the midrash. You remember that God creates Adam HaRishon, creates the first human being, and the angels do not like Adam. They're jealous of this new creature whom God seems to like a little too much. So God says, I'll show you how smart this new creature is. And God brings out an animal and says to the angels, what's that? They have never seen one before. So he says to Adam, what's that? Adam says, this is a dog, that is a cat, this is a giraffe, that is an elephant. He names the animals. Then God says to Adam, what should you be called? And Adam says, I should be called Adam ki me Adama lukachti. I should be called Adam because I come from Adama, earthling. Adam means earthling. Then God says to Adam, what should I be called? That's a great moment. Yes. Adam could have said, Irving, Zelda. Perfect. It's up to you. What should I be called? And Adam says, Lecha ra'ui likarei Adonai ki Adonai ta'al kol ma'asecha. You should be called Adonai because you are Lord over all you have made. Which I take to mean, that's our trip, not God's trip. We created that Lord-servant relationship because we needed it. We needed to submit. So when asked, we said, okay, you are Adonai. God isn't Adonai, God is Yud Hey Vav Hey, is the oneness of being. And the Torah is very careful today. If you think you understand what that is, if you think now that you have that name Yud Hey Vav Hey, you got it, you know what I will do? I will go off and conjugate myself and become a verb again. I will be whatever I will be. You will not catch me in that little black box of Adonai or Yud Hey Vav Hey. God is the ultimately elusive. That's what Ehiyah Asher Ehiyah means. My name is Yud Hey Vav Hey, but Ehiyah Asher Ehiyah. I will be whatever I will be. You will not. You cannot define me. You cannot grab me. You do not have hold of me. And so that's what we're talking about. We're talking about that elusive presence. We're talking about that word, Yod Hey Vav Hey. Notice, please, remember the Vav is a wow in ancient Hebrew. Notice it's all breath letters. Yeah, ha, and wow. There's no hard, crunchy dental or labial in there. There's no k, l, m. It's ah, yeah, ha, ha. It's all breath. You can breathe that name. That's how elusive it is. That's the nature of that elusiveness. It's a name that you can't hold on to. So we're talking about that kind of religion. How do you teach it? That's your job. How do we connect that kind of religion to a particular tradition? That's a long conversation, because this kind of religion is by nature universal. We're talking about a oneness of being, a universal truth, not about something to which we have an exclusive claim. Let me say it all one more way, and then I'll come back and we'll tie it up. In the 20th century, traditional religion fought two great battles that defined 20th century religious life. They were the battle against Darwin and the battle against biblical criticism. Yes, the battle against Darwin, against evolution, and the battle against who wrote the Bible. Traditional religion definitively lost both of those battles. Yes, in intelligent circles, I'm not talking about Kansas school boards or Republican candidates, but in intelligent circles, when you ask anybody how old is the world, people understand that the Darwinian evidence, and when I say Darwin, I mean the geology and the astrophysics and everything that goes with it, not just the evolution, but the scientific approach, is accepted. That's reality. I mean, Lubavitch and Rebbe could get up in the 1970s or so and say, no, the world really is 5,700 and whatever it was, 62 years old, and God put the fossils there to test our faith and gave us carbon dating to test our faith. And we all smiled and said, he's Lubavitch Rebbe, he's supposed to say that. But nobody to the left of Lubavitch took it seriously. One wonders how he could with a Western education, but that's another story. Jews did not get involved much in that battle. I would say in general, the battle of that evolution did not involve much Jewish activity. We were embarrassed about it. Jews are not Scopes trial kind of people. Because we want our kids to go to medical school. we believe in science. We're not Kentucky fight modernity people. But we shut up. We didn't know what to do. We still lift our cups every Friday night, and so do I. It's like heaven and earth were just completed. We love that story, right? That's our story. But we don't believe it. We have a deep relationship, a deep engagement with that story. But that engagement cannot be described as belief, not in any literal sense. And that's our problem. And let's not talk about that one. Let's talk about something else. Jews got much more involved in the biblical criticism discussion because that was toughest. That was, did God give the Torah? If God didn't give the Torah, then why do you have to do all these things? What's the authority for halakha? That scared Jews more, I would say. And so Jews did get involved in that. But traditional religion, I would say, has decisively lost both of those battles. You might think, if that's the case, then religion will be almost finished in the 21st century. It's just a mop-up operation. Religion has been disproven. And yet religion is a more powerful force in the 21st century than anybody would have dreamed. And it's not only those crazy evangelicals, it's us too. Because we find ourselves still somehow being spiritual people. Yes. We still want to sing to God about how beautiful life is, or gratitude, or cry out in our pain, or curse somebody when we're angry. We somehow find ourselves still having religious needs, even though we accept that the world is that old and the Torah was edited by people over a long period of time. That doesn't mean we are no longer religious people. So if you can't be a traditional believer in the literal sense, and yet you still are a religious person, where do you turn? I'm suggesting the turn to the mystical tradition, or some reading of the mystical tradition, is a way out. Because the mystical tradition is not about any kind of literalism. It's talking about some ancient truth about the nature of reality. And I have tried in my most recent book, Radical Judaism, some of you may have seen it, you can take a look at it, I have tried to say there is a way of reading the evolution story, there's a way of reading a scientific approach to religion that sees the one that exists from beginning of time as the one that undergoes the evolutionary process, the one that underlies the whole evolutionary drama. I've tried to say that if you open your eyes, there must be a biology teacher somewhere in the room, if you open your eyes and see the process, then you understand that evolution is the greatest religious drama of all time. That it's all about the magnificence of existence, and then filled with wonder, and can be told as a religious story, not to say God did this and God did that, but can be told as a religious story in a broader sense of what it means to have a spiritual appreciation of the wonder of nature and the magnificence of it all, and the awe we have before our place in it, and the awe we have of responsibility for it. I take all of that to be religious. And to find a language, a religious language that will allow us to infuse that with a kind of spiritual content, I think is much of what we have to do. I'm almost finished. I do want to leave some time for conversation. Let me just say one final thing. Postmodern religion is not the same as pre-modern religion. This rediscovery of the spiritual that's taking place in the 21st century does not mean we go back to the way things were in the 17th or 18th century. There are people waiting for us to do that, right? The pre-modern world was never entirely vanquished, and so it says, oh, welcome, we finally woke up and understand that we were right and modernity was wrong, so let's go recreate the 18th century in terms of role of women, in terms of style of leadership, in terms of authority structure. So I would say, no, I don't want that at all. And that's really what puts me on the heterodox side of the great debate in the Jewish community. I think that spiritual rediscovery has to be in the context of understanding, first, that religion is no longer a zero-sum game. If mine is true, every other one is false. We no longer, that was standard Western religion. Mine is true, yours is false. We no longer say that. We say we are recovering an ancient truth, glimpses into which exist in all the great traditions of humanity. And therefore we're willing to talk, and we're willing to learn. We're willing to hear what Vedanta teachers or Buddhist teachers or Sufi mystics might have to say about the spiritual life, and realize that we are somehow speaking the same language. And when we recover that tradition, we want it to be in a way that makes people more deeply themselves and more deeply free. I think there is a recovery of that tradition that can lead one to a very traditional life in terms of religious behavior, but yet maintains that sense of inner freedom. But I would say maintaining a sense of inner freedom, maintaining a sense of openness, maintaining an ability to talk across the lines, both between religious and secular truths, and between the truths of the spirit as posed by many religions. That's what it means to hold on to a sense that this is a postmodern spiritual quest and not a return to the past. That's what I want to say. And I understand you are educators, and how this fits into an educational mission and what you do is a conversation that I hope some of you will have. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Dick, is this what you wanted me to do?
It's actually more what Ellen wanted you to do.
Thanks, Jacob. So questions?
Feel free.
First of all, thank you. I felt like I was drinking from a fire hose. Just two questions. Where's the concept of the chosen people? What meaning does that have in the context of what you said? And second part is the modern state of Israel. How does that?
Chosenness does not play much role in my Judaism. I am sympathetic to Mordecai Kaplan, who found an outdated formulation. But let me say a word or two about it. I think chosenness made a great deal of sense, was a necessity. As Jews lived for 1,700 years as a minority, as a persecuted minority, in societies that claimed to supersede us. Both Christianity and Islam claimed that they had superseded Judaism, and it made all the sense in the world to leave Judaism behind, because look, history has proven it. Look, we rule the world, and you people are defeated. God is obviously on our side, not on your side. I think the answer to that was chosenness. The answer to that was, no, we are really God's beloved, and the day will come when God will come back and rescue us. And that wonderful line in Rashi where in Echa, the beginning of the Lamentations, it says, Jerusalem hayta ka'almana. Jerusalem has become like a widow. And Rashi says, ka'almana v'lo almana mamash sha'atid ba'ala lachzor eleha. She's like a widow, but she's not a real widow because her husband is going to come back to her. I think that's how we survived for a very long time. I completely understand that, sympathetically. But in the modern world, when we are responsible citizens in democratic societies, and especially, this goes to your second question, when we have a state of our own, and rule over people who are not Jews, I think chosenness has been a pernicious and morally dangerous concept. And I think it has led to some of the grave errors made by the State of Israel, which I love dearly and support fully, and of which I am very critical on certain matters, including both the treatment of its Arab minority, and I have a fear that a combination of the belief in chosenness and a resentment from many years of persecution, of course, including the Holocaust, led us to a certain dehumanization or less than fully human treatment of non-Jews in our society. And I feel it's a shame the Jewish people has to bear. And we diaspora Jews are not excused from responsibility for it, because we supported it. And that goes for the settlement of the occupied territories too, which I have been opposed to since 1967, I believe has been a terrible error, both politically and morally. And I'm not afraid to say that, and that has nothing to do with not supporting the state and loving the state and loving Hebrew culture and loving the revival of Judaism in the state and many other things. But I think that that the flaws of what we, the Jewish people, have created there are directly related to the legacy of chosenness and things that have come with it. Maybe that's not the answer you were looking for, but you got it.
To a student who's wrestling with this terror, this kind of black light, as it were, in terms of their own faith, in terms of their own questioning, what approach might you take when a student feels overwhelmed and not, who does not have the tools yet to understand this in a way in which faith is not discarded, in which there is an understanding that these moments are of it, are part of our history as humans, but it doesn't speak to us in this moment particularly. I don't know if you want.
Yeah, I think the history has to be taught and not avoided. I'm a great believer in age appropriateness, and you have to know who that kid is and what she is ready for. I think that's very important. And I'm no expert in 12-year-olds to tell you exactly what the she is ready for is. Heschel, when asked about Auschwitz and how could God do it, he used to say the question is not where was God at Auschwitz, but where was man at Auschwitz. And I think that's a big piece of the answer. It's not, for me it certainly isn't sufficient, and ultimately for Heschel it wasn't sufficient. But in terms of what message you're giving to your 12-year-old, I would say that's a big piece of the message. And then you are going to do a sort of finding of God in the acts of humanity that existed within the camps and so on. You're probably going to go there because the terrifying question that 12-year-old probably isn't ready for.
Can you talk a little, everyone here, my line here is that everyone here is a teacher of Torah, whether they're specifically a teacher of Torah or not.
As Nehemiah will tell you, I insist everybody in Hebrew college is a teacher of Hebrew, whether they're here or not.
We're on similar ground there, but can you speak a little bit about the role of teaching children and the gift we give children? We're very much about the questions here and seeking the questions and not telling children we have an answer to questions that are difficult or not so difficult, but can you speak a little in Hasidic thinking about the role of children?
I'll say two things. First of all, there is only one mitzvah Jews really care about in this generation, that is Vishinat Tamlavadach, teach them to your children. Parents and kids here, I presume, because I want my kid to know she's a Jew. I want my son to have some kind of Jewish heritage. Even in families where the thick gruel of Judaism has become a watery soup and there's no content left, they need to pass it down. That's why Jews are so traumatized over intermarriage, I think, because my grandchildren won't have received the legacy. I will somehow have failed in passing it down. Jews have a very strong sense of that, a very strong commitment to it. I mean, everybody, all human beings live in the nexus between what we receive from our grandparents and what we give to our grandchildren. But Jews somehow have a particularly strong sense of that, partly because of persecution and minority status and everything else. There's that very deep commitment to passing it down, and I think that's what you are somehow in the business of. And yes, that has to do with your secular teachers as well as your Jewish teachers, because part of what they're passing down is a values orientation. I am, because I'm not a believer that God has chosen the Jewish people from among all peoples, uniquely, only, distinctively, or we say singularly. I believe we have a distinctive relationship with God, as all the great traditions have distinctive relationships. But I do believe in covenant, that the Jewish people is covenanted by its own choice to its two formative moments, which are the Exodus and Sinai. I think we were forged as a people by having been slaves, by the memory of slavery, the memory of liberation, and then standing before the mountain and hearing what we heard and creating a people, a society, a responsible community around it. And I think that legacy is very much there among Jews. It's there in secular Jews who don't know it's there. I think the fact that Jewish names appear on the mastheads of every human rights organization in the Western world is not accidental. And it's not just about Auschwitz. It's about that legacy of we were slaves and we were liberated from slavery. It's about a Jewish belief that every human being is the image of God. Whatever that means to us, even for people who don't believe in God, they believe human beings are the image of God. And I think that's a piece that gets conveyed in our secular, quote-unquote, education as in our religious education. One of the things I have sought to do in my life is to create what I call a seeker-friendly Judaism. There are constructions of Judaism that are not very friendly to seekers. The Torah is already given. We have all the answers. They're there. You can look them up. Don't bother me. If you have questions, either Rabbi will give you answers and then go away. But being a seeker, of course, is not about having a question that wants an answer. It's a quest. And a quest, as distinct from a question, goes on forever. One of my favorite biblical verses is Bakshu Fanav Tamid. Seek God's face always, which is to say it's not something that's over, that you find it and then you're finished. And to create a Judaism that's friendly to these seekers I talk about in this little essay, and I say I'm one of them. Abraham Avinu, after all, Abraham, our father, was a seeker. Judaism was created presumably by a seeker. If you read Abraham as the Midrash says, he tried this, he tried that. He was a religious experimenter, and then he discovers. And I would like to make sure there's room for him in the Jewish community in this generation.
I'm just wondering, I presented a different way of thinking about God. There's a lot to think about. Just how do you take that sort of understanding and then move forward with the sort of traditional liturgy or halakha, which is very different than that kind of Judaism that you're talking about?
Those are two very different questions. Halakha, I would say, is less of a problem.
Jewish law.
Jewish law, sorry. Halakha, Jewish law is I don't like the translation. I'm going to say the path. Okay, the Jewish path, praxis. I fight against translation of halakha as well. It comes to be codified in legal-looking forms, but it's about the halakha midracha. It's about walking in the ways of God. It's the path. I'm a person who wears the garment of halakha pretty lightly, which is to say I pick and choose, and there are things I'm comfortable with and things I'm not, and that's my own personal history and needs. Other people have different personal histories and needs and pick much more of halakha to express many of the same theological concepts that I'm expressing. That is, this neo-Hasidic world that I'm talking about ranges from people very observant to people less observant, significantly less observant than I am. And I think that's really, to my understanding, after many years of dealing with it, it has a lot to do with psychological makeup and personal story. And I don't think there's anything in this vision which says you need to be more halakhic or less halakhic. There's certain hard-nut issues, including women's issues and so on, that have to be dealt with, but I don't think this dictates that. The Siddur is very different because you open it, you say Baruch Atah, and well, my midrash. I'll give you my quick midrash, which works for me some days. My quick midrash says, ata, you, or the thou of the prayer book, the Old English prayer book. The ata is made up of 3 Hebrew letters, Aleph, Tav, Hey. Aleph and Tav are the beginning and end of the alphabet. Everything from A to Z. Jesus says, I am Alpha and Omega in the New Testament, you may remember. Everything was created by the 22 letters, right? Through the letters of creation, mystical letters of creation. So Aleph and Tav means everything that exists. But when you put them together, Aleph and Tav, everything that exists, you have Et. Et is the word for the direct object. You have things. You have objective things. To that word Et, you add the Hey, which stands for the name of God. And you transform it into someone you can talk to. I understand that all personification is projection. Yes, that all of our personal images of God are projections from humanity. And I nevertheless allow for that projection because I think we need it. Sometimes I say God creates us in the divine image and we are obliged to return the favor. Because for us to create a bridge of relationship, we need that personified being. But we should also understand that it's we who have created it. Yeah, sometimes that works. Please.
Just to follow up on that, actually, on that comment, is there something, would you say that there may be a shortcoming in our imagination for what God is, and maybe that's not a shortcoming, there's something about that, some lack of imagination that we have of what God is, and that sort of is a struggle that we end up passing down and through time, and that if we were just, even if we weren't to have to imagine God, if you said we could sort of appreciate oneness, if we looked outside, you could just see amazing things, but that we're not sort of in a culture of appreciation, that we're really in more of a culture of sort of competition, and is that something that...
150%, absolutely. There's several distinct comments there, and they're all right. Yes, there's a comment about our culture, that we're in a culture of competition and use the natural world rather than appreciate the natural world. To my mind, religious education should have a lot to do with developing religious sensibilities in kids. And that means a sense of wonder. I think you should be out there training your kids to use cameras and nature photography and see plants blossom and be aware of the seasons of the year. They should be out at retreats getting up at sunrise and watching it, and all those kinds of things I think are very important in developing spiritual awareness, and I think that is completely at one with Judaism, and I think you can easily make that Kriyat Shema Bismana, you can easily make that, you say the Shema as the sun comes up, you can integrate it with Judaism very, very well, and it's natural, that's not artificial, that is Judaism. The Baal Shem Tov said, by the way, to say the Shema after the sun is already out is hardly worth it. He didn't say that. He said it's hardly worth it. Because that's really what it's about. And yes, of course, we are finite beings, and you're talking about the infinite. And therefore our imagination can, by its nature, never go all the way. One of the great masters of that is Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, who gave up conventional ways of teaching and turned to fantasy and imagination and told his famous tales, because he believed the human imagination could never reach, and he was working at stretching the imagination. And I think stretching the imagination is a very nice kind of exercise to do as an educator too.
To follow up on that, how can we as teachers who often spend so much of our time focused on passing that down to our students, how can we reclaim some of that for ourselves as well during the day?
Yeah, well, that's a nice question. And it's up to you. That is to say, as I said here about which 12-year-old it is we're talking about, it's which teachers we're talking about. But a meditation group for 15 minutes in the middle of the day in the teacher's room, or a Nigun singing group, or a sort of inspirational reading. Each week somebody else provides a reading and you talk about it for 10 minutes. You have to know what vehicle fits you. But to do something to revive the teacher's spiritual imagination, I would say would be a wonderful thing to do. And a school should be working with its teachers as well as with its kids, no question about that. You have to. Otherwise you run dry. I mean, I have spent most of my life teaching rabbis, training rabbis. That's what I do. done it in 3 or 4 different incarnations. My wife says some guys, when they turn a certain age, get a little red sports car every few years. I wind up with a little red rabbinical school every few years. And, maybe my most basic message to these future rabbis is, if you don't have a spiritual life of your own, you're going to run dry very quickly. Your congregants are going to know it. Then it becomes just a show. So cultivating your own spiritual life is an essential part of what training to be a rabbi means. And I would say Jewish educator in general. I would say cultivating your own spiritual garden is no small part of it. That's a good place to end that.
It's a good place to end. Thank you so much.